So thanks everyone for joining this morning. I'm really sorry to not be there. I really love Trier. So as I said in the introduction, my name's Bichet. I'm counsel at Cooley in Brussels, which is a private practice law firm. So I'm part of Cooley's international products law team. And basically what we do, we help clients understand what their obligations are before a product goes on the market, help them try to understand the new obligations and new laws that are coming down the line, and also help with crisis management. So for example, if a product that they've manufactured needs to be recalled or withdrawn from the market. So as you might imagine, the general product safety regulation is quite a big thing for us. And that's what we're going to be speaking about today. So just taking a quick look at the timing, the General Product Safety Regulation, or Gpsr, as we're calling it, there's quite a lot of acronyms flying around, it's a new law. It entered into force in June of this year, of 2023. And what it will do, it's going to repeal and replace the existing General Product Safety Directive, or GPSD. So right now we're in what we call the transition period, where the directive continues to apply to companies, to regulators, to consumers, but everyone's getting ready for the new provisions of the GPSR to start applying, which is going to happen in December of next year, so of 2024. And before we run through the new provisions of the GPSR, I thought it might be helpful just to take a little step back and look at how the GPSD framework currently works in Europe. I think it's quite helpful just to have that context for understanding the GPSR and how that's going to replace it. I'll run through that quite quickly. Probably a lot of you are already familiar. But just to say, in the EU, there are already comprehensive sector regimes that fully regulate certain product types. So on the slide there, we've got medicines, food, animal feed are completely regulated at EU level. For other types of products, so consumer products, the GPSD establishes the general principle that all products that are placed or made available on the EU market need to be safe. Sometimes we refer to this as the safety net. So that's a general principle that applies to all consumer products. We then have, running underneath the GPSD, sector-specific legislation that will apply to specific groups of products and provide further details on what those products need to do to be considered safe. To the extent that there's any gaps in those rules, the GPSD steps in and applies the general safety requirement as this kind of safety net. For products where there's not specific sector legislation, the GPSD applies in its entirety, and that will be then complemented by, in many cases, standards. So we have European standards, national standards, international standards, and that's what you see running along the bottom in green there. The GPSD, so the directive also established obligations for the member states to make sure that producers and distributors were complying with their obligations. It gave them powers to do safety checks and take action to ensure compliance. So I was talking about product withdrawals or product recalls, this kind of thing, if there are safety issues. So that's the current system. And just before we go on to talk about the new system that's coming, a little word on why it was revised. So I think the kind of first and most obvious point is that the GPSD was over 20 years old. It wasn't really up to date with new technologies or the reality of how products are often sold today, which is online. Reform was already discussed about 10 years ago in Europe, and there was a failed attempt in 2013 to update the GPSD. The reason that it failed at that time was because the EU had attempted to introduce country of origin requirements, and these just couldn't be agreed upon. But in the meantime, various other pieces of legislation have cropped up in the EU. So one good example of this is the market surveillance regulation. And that contains obligations like a requirement that there be a responsible person in Europe for harmonized products. So these are for products that bear the CE marking. But we don't have anything equivalent that applies to the non-harmonized products that are completely covered by the GPST. So I attended a conference recently where the European Commission were speaking about the Gpsr, and they said that from their perspective, they saw three main reasons to update the GPST. The first one was that in reality, there were still too many unsafe products on the European market. So that was seen as an indication that the system maybe wasn't quite fit for purpose. The second reason was because for competition considerations. So it was seen that there was a kind of unfair playing field in the EU market because some products met safety standards while others didn't, creating kind of unfair conditions of competition. And thirdly, all this resulted in cost for society and also for consumers. So from that perspective, there was also seen as an impetus or a need to update the GPST, the old legislation. So moving on now to look at the Gpsr itself. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to run through some of the key features of the regulation, and then at the end we'll discuss practical impacts, and then we'll still have time for some discussion. So one of the big changes are the updates to aspects for assessing safety of products, and this is worth mentioning. So the Gpsr contains new rules on what aspects should be taken into account when deciding whether or not a product is safe. These are all listed in Article 6 of the new law, and they include some aspects that we might already anticipate: the characteristics of the product itself, the instructions that are provided with it for assembly, but some of the other aspects are more kind of progressive or noteworthy compared to what we're used to seeing in EU legislation. So for example, Article 6E says that when assessing safety, the categories of consumers using the product should be considered, in particular, risk for vulnerable consumers such as children, older people, or people with disabilities, as well as the impact of gender differences on health and safety. Article 6B and C also require taking into account the effect of other products where it's reasonably foreseeable that a product will be used with another product. So this is things like interconnected products. It's also necessary to take into account the impact of software updates or downloads on the safety of the product. There's also an obligation to take into account appropriate cybersecurity features necessary to protect the product, where these are required by the nature of the product. So obviously that won't be relevant for things like paper, but it might be relevant for a consumer device. We can imagine that this is going to be linked to compliance with the new EU Cyber Resilience Act that's being negotiated at the moment. And I know that was discussed in one of the sessions yesterday at the conference. Another one worth noting is that when we're thinking about the aspects to take into account for the safety of the product, it's also necessary to take into account the evolving learning and predictive functionalities of a product. So that's things like the risks that can be posed by AI that's embedded in products. Again, this is something that going forward is likely to be shaped by other pieces of EU legislation like the AI Act, which we also talked about yesterday. So another kind of noteworthy feature of the Gpsr is that when we're thinking about safety aspects, there's this mention of mental health risks. The original Commission proposal went a little bit further than what we've ended up with in the regulation. So the original proposal said that there would be a requirement to take into account risks to health and safety when assessing the safety of a product, including mental health risks. Still, what we have in the regulation is that a safe product is defined as one that's consistent with a high level of protection of health and safety. And in the recitals, there's still a reference to mental health. So the recitals of the Gpsr say that the World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of disease or infirmity. And there's also recital 23, which I've put on the slide there, which specifically for digital connected products. And it says that the safety assessment should take into account the health risk posed by digital connected products, including on mental health, and especially for vulnerable consumers such as children. So that's something that when we're advising clients, particularly device manufacturers, that they have to be, when they're doing the pre-market safety assessment, they have to be thinking about health in this more holistic way going forwards. So the next thing to mention are the new requirements specifically for non-harmonized products. So when I say non-harmonized products, I mean products that are not covered by other pieces of sector-specific legislation that would require CE marking. So just to give a couple of examples, the low voltage directive that applies to a lot of electronic products, or the toy safety directive that would apply to products that qualify as toys. These are what we call harmonized products. For the non-harmonized products, so that's things like childcare products, like strollers, things like clothing, accessories for your phone that don't require to bear the CE mark. These are the non-harmonized products. And the Gpsr lays down quite a lot of new requirements for non-harmonized products that will align them more closely with the rules that already apply to harmonized products in the market surveillance regulation. So this includes an obligation for manufacturers in the EU to carry out an internal risk analysis before the product's placed on the market, then to drop a technical file and keep that file updated. The extent to which the file needs to be updated depends a little bit on the risks that are posed by the product. There's also new requirements for labeling the product and for adding traceability information. Just a little word on e-labeling. So we thought that when they revised the GPSD, one thing that might be introduced is the option for manufacturers to do e-labeling. So just to provide the information by QR code, for example, to replace physical markings. This wasn't adopted in the final legislation. So there is a provision that says there's nothing to stop you from providing the information digitally, but physical labeling is still required. So that's kind of a maintenance of the status quo there. But on the non-harmonized products, another thing just to mention is that there's this new obligation that they have a responsible person established in the EU to comply with certain obligations. So this is, for example, to comply with the labeling requirements and to include certain information about the responsible person. Then online sales is another big one. So as I said, one of the reasons for revising the GPSD was to kind of take into account more the reality of online sales and the fact that consumers in the EU are often purchasing online, sometimes from outside the EU. So the Gpsr introduces new requirements for online offers. These are in Article 19 of the regulation. And this includes an obligation to display any warnings or safety information that would be required on the product itself, on its packaging or in its documents. Those have to be now displayed online when the offer is made to consumers in the EU. It's also necessary to display information allowing the identification of the product, and also the name and contact details of the manufacturer and the responsible person in the EU where that's applicable. Another novelty of the new regulation is the requirement for accident reporting. So the new rules are introducing a mandatory obligation on manufacturers to notify authorities via the EU safety gate system if there's any accidents caused by their products. Now, what's an accident? There is a threshold to trigger this reporting obligation that was included in the final text of the Gpsr. This wasn't included in the original Commission proposal, so that's something that from our perspective and from our client's perspective was kind of very welcome to understand when this obligation is actually going to kick in. So this is occurrences associated with the use of a product that resulted in an individual's death or in a serious adverse effect on that individual's health and safety. That can be permanent or temporary. and includes injuries, other damage to the body, illnesses, and chronic health effects. So that's what the trigger is for doing for making this report via SafetyGate. The time limit to file an accident report is without undue delay from the moment that the manufacturer knows about the accident. In the original proposal, that was 2 days. So here there's a little bit of flexibility that you can read in both senses. It might mean report needs to be made in less than 2 days. It might mean that there's a little bit more time. Then where a manufacturer is not established in the EU, this is the relevance of having a responsible person in Europe. The obligation to report the accident would fall on the responsible person in the EU, who will then have to make a report through SafetyGate. There's also a separate obligation that's maybe worth mentioning when we think about accident reporting, and that's for online marketplaces. So this is found in another article of the regulation, in Article 22. And that's an obligation to cooperate with regards to any accidents that's been notified to the online marketplace and reporting them without undue delay to reporting to the manufacturer of the product that caused the accident. So I think this is quite novel. It remains to be seen how this is going to work in practice. It's not something that we have right now in Europe. So that's something new, something big in the Gpsr. Then this brings us on quite nicely to talk about another key feature, which are the new obligations for online marketplaces. So these are aimed at providers of online marketplaces, which are defined as providers of intermediary services using an online interface, which allows a consumer to conclude distance contracts with traders for the sale of products. The Gpsr establishes quite a lot of new obligations for these online marketplaces. And just to give a couple of examples of these, that's establishing a single point of contact for the Market Surveillance Authority and also for consumers. There's an obligation to cooperate with the national authorities in the EU. There's an obligation to respond to notices from authorities within 2 working days, so very short in practice. And also to process notices related to product safety issues that were notified under the Notice and Action mechanism in the Digital Services Act within 3 working days. The Notice and Action mechanism in the Digital Services Act is basically a mechanism that would allow individuals or companies to notify the online marketplace of any illegal content that they find on the platform. So here, specific to product safety issues, there's this deadline of 3 working days to process that. Under the Gpsr, there's also obligations for online marketplaces to design the interface in a way that enables traders to provide the information that they need to provide for online offers. There's an obligation to report dangerous products via SafetyGate, to report accidents via SafetyGate, so that's what we just talked about, and also to directly notify affected consumers about recalls and publish certain information about recalls, and we'll come on to discuss that on the next slide. So as you can see, all this is quite significant. It gives almost a sort of quasi-regulatory role to online marketplaces, and we think obviously this will have a big impact on the providers of the marketplaces themselves, but we're also anticipating for our clients who are mostly product manufacturers that this will also have a big impact on them, because in terms of enforcement, it basically means that there's someone else with an obligation to notify the authorities. So they might find that products they place on the market reports are made to the authorities by third parties. So let's take Amazon for an example, where they find some safety issues. So there's this kind of now double, quasi-regulatory role being given to the online marketplaces. So a quick word on SafetyGate. Under the Gpsr, it will become mandatory to use SafetyGate. So SafetyGate is the EU portal for notifying the authorities of product safety issues. This will become mandatory to report product recalls, and also the new accident reporting requirements need to be done via SafetyGate. Currently, it's not mandatory for economic operators to use SafetyGate to notify recalls, although in practice this is what most companies are doing anyway at the moment. So on product recalls, the Gpsr sets down some new requirements for advertising product recalls and recall notices. These new requirements come out of a criticism that the current recall system doesn't function very effectively. And often in reality, if there is a product recall, consumers don't actually find out that the product that they've purchased has been recalled. They're not aware of the remedies that are available to them. So the new provisions in the Gpsr attempt to kind of remedy that. So going forward, where a product needs to be recalled or where information needs to be given to consumers to make sure that they can safely use their product, economic operators need to make sure that affected consumers are notified, can be identified and also notified directly and without undue delay. Now, there's this new provision which says that companies that collect consumers' personal data and online marketplaces are required to make use of that information that they already have for the purposes of recalls and for recall notices. There's also an obligation to publish the recall notice or the safety warning through channels that have the widest possible reach. So these can be things like the company's website, social media channels, if that's the easiest way to contact consumers, retail outlets, amongst others. And there's an obligation that these notices be accessible also to consumers with disabilities. There's also new requirements for the content and form of recall notices, and a ban on using certain words that companies in practice are often using at the moment. So these are things like voluntary, precautionary, in rare situations, or saying in the recall notices that there have been no reported accidents to try to kind of minimize the perception of the risks posed. So going forward under the Gpsr, it won't be possible to use any of that kind of language. There's also new rules on the remedies that should be available to consumers where a product's being recalled. So the economic operator that's running the recall needs to provide consumers with at least two of the following three options. So one is a refund of the value of the recalled product, and that refund needs to be at least the price paid by the consumer. This takes away the option for manufacturers to deduct a sum to take into account the fact that the product might be old, that might have been significantly used. But now it's clear going forward that that refund needs to be at least the value of the product that the consumer pays. The second option that two of the three should be offered is a repair of the product or a replacement with one of the same type. The Gpsr does allow, where it's impossible or disproportionate, to offer two of these three remedies. So we might imagine that occurring, for example, where a product is no longer being manufactured, it might be impossible to repair it or to replace it. In that case, it would be acceptable to just provide one remedy, which would be a refund. There had been initially proposed wording in the Commission's proposal in the recitals to say the most sustainable remedy should be preferred, but that ended up getting removed from the final text of the regulation. So just a word on enforcement of these requirements. Again, taking a step back, one of the big aims of the new regulation was to make sure that only safe products make their way onto the EU market. And there had been kind of quite significant criticism of under-enforcement in Europe of the product safety regime. So to respond to this, the Gpsr introduces increased enforcement mechanisms. So that includes that the Commission should organise on a regular basis joint activities between the national authorities to inspect products, that there should be obligations to carry out coordinated sweeps on particular products or product categories to check their compliance with the safety requirements, There's also new provisions on international cooperation between the Commission and other international regulators. And this we think will have an impact where there's a global recall, for example, where products are being recalled in China and Brazil, in Europe, that there's this option that the authorities could talk to each other. There's the requirement that we see in a lot of EU regulation, which is that penalties that are set at the national level must be effective, proportionate and dissuasive. That's maybe a bit of a step back from the Commission's original proposal, which had said that fines need to be at least 4% of the company's annual turnover. Then the last thing I wanted to mention is just the class action. So Gpsr also amends the new EU Representative Actions Directive that would allow group actions to be brought in Europe for any breaches of the Gpsr. This is different from under the current rules, where only certain breaches of the GPSD are included. And we're anticipating that this is something that consumer groups are likely to make use of going forward. So just to finish up, a little word on the practical implications of all this. So we're not yet there. It's a little bit speculative as to what the implications in practice are going to be of the Gpsr. But I think actually circling back, so this slide is just about how it applies to products, kind of recapping. So just to say that all of the obligations that we've discussed today will apply to the non-harmonized products, and then the other obligations on the right side of the slide there will apply to the harmonized or CE marked products. And in terms of practical implications, so I think for the non-harmonized products, there will be quite significant pre-market practical implications for the manufacturers of non-harmonized products. They'll have these new obligations to comply with that they don't have currently before they can launch products in the EU. Probably there'll be less significant changes there for the manufacturers of the harmonized or the CE mark products. But yeah, just kind of speculating on what the practical implications will be, we think the main differences will be felt post-market with the introduction of the accident reporting mechanism, with the stricter rules around recalls, and also the threat of pan-European representative actions being brought if there's non-compliance with the product safety rules. We think the obligations for online manufacturers are likely to have quite a significant impact on practice. We spoke a little bit about that, both for the manufacturers of the products that are being sold on the online marketplaces, and also for the marketplaces themselves. Hopefully all this together will have an effect of resulting in safer products for the European consumers. And then just last thing I wanted to add before we move on to the discussion is that there are going to be guidelines prepared. The Commission's confirmed that they're working on them right now, that national authorities are going to be consulted on these. And hopefully that should help, because I think with the text of the regulation, the fact that it's not yet enforced, there are still quite a few open questions where it will be helpful to have that additional guidance. So I think that's kind of everything I wanted to say. I'm conscious that was a very quick run through of all these new requirements, but now happy to open the floor if anyone has questions.